Can start. Welcome everybody. Today we have an important meeting, Zoom conference. Today it's my pleasure to introduce you to Sam Sokol. The title of today's lecture is How Putin's Denazification has devastated the Ukrainian Jewry. Today we have Natan Sharansky, who will introduce Sam. Natan is the chair of ISGAP, and many of you on this call know him. He's the former head of the Jewish Agency. He's the current ISGAP chair. He's a human rights icon and really, I think, a moral and ethical leader of the Jewish people to a large extent, and to the human rights community, and served in the Israeli government. It's a great honor that he is with us today. And today, it's also an honor for Sam. Sam is a research scholar at ISGAP. He's actually one of the first research scholars that we had many years ago. Sam is currently a reporter for Haaretz newspaper. He's worked for the Jerusalem Post and published widely around the world in leading newspapers and magazines. He's previously, such as the Jewish Telegraph Agency, Israel Broadcasting Authority, and the Times of Israel. He's the author of Putin's Hybrid War and the Jews, Anti-Semitism Propaganda and the Displacement of Ukrainian Jewry. This was, we had the great honor of publishing Sam's original book at ISGAP. And as many of you will hear today, today is basically a book launch honoring Sam's very important work. Sam worked diligently to put a revised edition together, which sort of updates the current situation, the crisis in Ukraine, Russia. So we actually launched it a week ago. It's available on our website or on Amazon. So I urge everybody to read it. It's a very important and timely book from a journalist and an intellectual with keen insight and even foresight. So it's an honor that Sam is here. And I'd like to turn it over to Natan Sharansky to introduce our speaker. So Natan, thank you for being here as well.
Thank you. I am very glad as the head of ISGAP, but also as the one who was born in Donetsk and grew in Donbass, and then studied in Moscow and was arrested in Moscow, and then was involved in many developments between Russia, Ukraine, and Israel, and then as the head of Jewish Agency dealing with evacuation of Jews from these communities. So I'm really very glad and proud that we can present this book of Sam. I have to say that from the beginning of this awful conflict, not conflict, barbaric aggression of Putin against Ukraine, I am asked, I'm interviewed regularly and try to explain the complexity of it, but journalists usually don't have patience. They say, well, okay, but explain us quickly in one word. Is it anti-Semitic? Is it against Jews of Russia? Is it against Jews of Ukraine? Who is here bad guy? And of course, to say who is bad guy and who is good guy is very easy. But to explain needs time, patience, and they have no patience. So I have to say that Sam showed not only talent and energy and knowledge, but unbelievable patience. So many years he's dealing with, I think he was one of the first who understood how important this war is for the world. And 8 years ago, and 7 years ago, 5 years ago, each time when I was meeting him, when he was a journalist of Jerusalem Post or representing any other newslet, he was dealing and studying and writing about this conflict. And that's why it is an extremely important book. People can say, how it can be that it's not about it's not Jewish war. It's the big Jewish communities and so on. And I explain, no, you know, the leader of Ukraine is Zelensky, who is openly Jewish. The leader of Russia is Putin, and with as many bad words as can say about him. I have to say, for the first time in 1,000 years in Russia, the leader is not only not anti-Semite, but he's sympathetic for Jews. So it's not because of Jews this war started. We can speak about the conflict between democracy and the dictatorship, and no doubt that Ukraine and Russia in many ways are very similar. Well, first of all, Soviet history is similar, but the 300 years it was one country. And after they got independence, both have problems with corruption, and both have problems with connection between the political leaders and oligarchs. But the real difference is that in one country, they stuck to their right for free elections, and 6 presidents replace one another. And when the people are not satisfied, they go to Maidan, to the square, and then they vote. And in Russia, there were only 2 presidents, and one president is already 22 years, and his main efforts are to remove the freedom from public square. It can be said that it's conflict between nationalisms, nationalism, which is building the nation, Ukrainian nationalism, and imperialist nationalism, which wants to bring back the empire and to conquer the nations. But it's not about anti-Semitism. Nevertheless, it started from the statement of Putin that we have to denazify Ukraine, and he declared that it's all a bunch of Nazis and anti-Semites, and when said, challenge, but why there are so many Jews, including the president, then it was said, so what? Jews can also be anti-Semites. Hitler also was Jewish, and suddenly the old Soviet times lies are coming, and they used the most primitive anti-Semitic statements, and one can't understand what they have to do with this war. On the other hand, of course, we are now all feel that this Azov defenders of Mariupol are real heroes, but we should not forget, and Sam Sokol, his book reminds us about it, from where they started. They started from ultranationalism, which was bordering anti-Semitism very often. And when Zelensky is a real hero of our time and inspiring all the free world, is coming and speaking to Israelis. And by the way, I think he is very right, speaking to the free world every day, to the other country, with one message: we are fighting for you, for the free world. Why you're not giving us this weapon and this weapon and this weapon and this weapon? He's right. That's the right way to speak, and he has all the moral right. But then when he speaks to Israelis and says, and by the way, exactly as Ukrainians were saving you in the time of Holocaust, it's your time to save Ukrainians. And then Israel is in shock. How can say such things? And I have to remind in my interviews, look, he was not speaking to us as a historian. He was speaking to us as a chief, as the commander-in-chief whose soldiers are under the fire, whose people are killed. He's coming for 10 minutes from his running the war, speaking for 10 minutes to us and goes back. We have to understand, so on. But I know this problem very well. It's a really serious problem, because I am also the chairman, not only of ISGAP, of the Babi Yar Memorial Project. And I know how, at the same time, we were all the time attacked. On one hand, first of all, we had a great cooperation with the government of Ukraine, but we are attacked by those who are saying, but there is Russian influence and we have to finish with Russian influence in our country. On the other hand, there are those who are saying, but what about Holodomor? There should be one museum of Holocaust and Holodomor Bayachad. So it's much more complicated than it seems. No doubt it's black against white, good against evil, but all the Jewish aspect, and as I just said to Sam, I think the tragedy of Russian Jewry as a result of this war will be even bigger than the tragedy of Ukrainian Jewry. So of course, it's big. And Aliyah from Russia to Israel will be there and bigger than Aliyah from Ukraine. But to understand all these complexities, you need patience and you need serious analysis. And I am very glad that Sam had enough intelligence, talent, but also patience to go so deep in analyzing all these phenomena. Thank you, Sam, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. I very much appreciate your kind words, Natan. It's incredibly heartening to hear that. Honestly, I never thought that I would get involved in the subject of Ukraine. When I started covering the diaspora beat at the Jerusalem Post in 2013, I really thought that I would end up covering events in Poland or Hungary or in the Baltics. But what happened was that when people came out to the Maidan, to the central square of Kiev in late 2013, early 2014, it was a story that I couldn't ignore, because starting prior to the Maidan, members of the ultranationalist anti-Semitic Svoboda party had taken about, I want to say, 7% of seats in the Ukrainian parliament, the Verkhovna Rada. And there was sort of a sense that because of the high visibility of members of Svoboda and other right-wing movements in the Maidan, that this could be something that would be a danger to the Jewish community. And there was a legitimate worry at the time that anti-Semitism was on the rise in Ukraine. And I ended up going and reporting from there. And one of the motifs that kept recurring was that the Russians, even back then, were starting to use any manifestation of anti-Semitism in Ukraine to tar the Ukrainians as anti-Semites, as a whole, saying not just that there's an incident here or an incident there, but that Ukrainians are anti-Semitic on the most basic level. And this is, something that's a very useful rhetorical tool in the former Soviet Union. Since the breakup of the USSR, Putin has revived and strengthened the cult of the Great Patriotic War, making the victory over fascism an integral part of Russian identity. Now, there's really a feeling among many Russians that Ukraine is not an independent country. Ukrainians aren't an independent ethnic group, that Ukrainian isn't an independent language, it's just a dialect of Russian. There's a feeling that, and there's a conflation between Ukrainian patriotism and Ukrainian ultranationalism. There's a tendency to tar anyone who stands up for Ukraine as a Banderite, a follower of Stepan Bandera, who was the leader of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the UN, during the Second World War. This was a avowedly fascist movement that worked with the Nazis and whose militant wing, the UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, killed thousands of Jews, and estimates vary, but around up to 100,000 Poles. So there's been a history from the Soviet period until today of branding any sort of Ukrainian nationalism or patriotism as Banderism, as anti-Semitic, as racist and fascist. So the very nature of the Euromaidan movement, when they were trying to depose their pro-Russian leader, Viktor Yanukovych, was that they were trying to move more toward in a European direction than in a Russian direction. And this was something that the Russians fundamentally couldn't accept. Now, during the Euromaidan, there were a series of anti-Semitic incidents, Jews being beaten up in Kiev. And many of the local leaders that I spoke with, rather than, they said, we don't necessarily know who's doing this, but there was a feeling among many community leaders that these were actually provocations being carried out by the Russians. You would ask the local rabbis, local community leaders, the heads of different organizations, and there was always the same refrain: it's got to be the Russians. And to this day, we don't really know who is behind each specific incident. But what we saw in the coming months and years was that sort of use and misuse of anti-Semitism by the Russians. So after the Maidan, when Yanukovych fled to Russia, you had an interim government where Svoboda, these hard right anti-Semites, held several positions in the in the cabinet, and the worry about Ukrainian anti-Semitism increased. And there was, as I said, a very legitimate fear of the direction Ukraine would go in. But what we saw is, as soon as they opened up elections for the first post-revolutionary elections, the representation of the hard right in Ukraine basically evaporated. Svoboda went from 7% of parliament to, I think, one representative out of more than 400 seats. But that didn't stop the Russians from essentially using the same rhetoric that they're using now. Now, in 2022, they're saying that they need to denazify. In 2014, Putin gave a speech in which he said that he reserves the right to use military force to defend against a rampage of nationalism and anti-Semitism going across Ukraine. And this was the rhetoric that they used to justify the invasion and annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in March 2014. And that during that period, we saw one of the first alleged post-Maidan incidents of an anti-Semitic provocation. There was a synagogue in Crimea, a reform temple, whose rabbi, the morning after the first unmarked Russian troops showed up in Crimea and started spreading out through the peninsula, he shows up in his synagogue and he finds the logo of the Pravi sector movement, a far-right movement, written on the door of his synagogue, along with anti-Semitic slogans. Now, he's confused. He later told me. He said, one, this is a group that isn't active in Crimea. Two, their logo is backwards. Three, it shows up after the Russians show up. And what ended up happening is he became very outspoken against the Russians, and he said he's leaving Ukraine. He doesn't want to live under Russian control. Well, the Russians somehow get him to agree to have a crew from Russia Today, from their propaganda channel, to follow him as he's packing up and moving. And they later aired an English language report on him where they edited what he said to make it look like, instead of saying that he doesn't want to live under Russia, and remember, this is a very anti-Russian guy, it looks like he's saying that he's scared of the Ukrainians and he has to get out. Now, why he would flee from the Ukrainians once the Russians took over is an open question. But this rabbi ended up telling me that he felt like he needed a psychologist. He wanted to get drunk and see a shrink, were his words, because he just couldn't believe that they twisted what he said. And over the coming years, what we saw is an increase in both Russian aggression and Russian anti-Semitic rhetoric. So on the one hand, they moved on from taking Crimea to fomenting insurgency in the eastern oblasts of Donetsk and Lugansk, in an area on the Russian border in the east known as the Donbass, which was the industrial heart of Ukraine, a very important economic area, which was heavily Russophone. And during this period, you saw an increase in reports in Russian media and statements by Russian officials claiming Ukrainian anti-Semitism. So at one point, there was a story that they ran in Izvestia that I remember, where they claimed that members of Pravi sector were running amok in the port city of Odessa, beating up Jews. And I remember I was sitting in the Jerusalem Post newsroom in Jerusalem, and I see this report, and I call up a guy I know in Odessa, one of the community leaders, and I go, "Hey, is there a pogrom in Odessa?" And he goes, "Hold on, let me check." And I hear him joking to someone next to him. And he turns back to me on the phone and he goes, no pogroms here. Any pogroms in Israel? And, it's just obviously it had been totally made up. And by the same token, there were incidents in which Russian television ran excerpts from a letter purportedly written by a Jewish leader in Belgium, calling on the world to take action against Ukraine for shutting down Jewish schools, newspapers, and institutions. I happen to know this Jewish leader. I call him up. He says, no, total bullshit. I never said or wrote anything like that. And this was a major leitmotif in the Russian propaganda and the Russian excuses for their aggression in Ukraine. Now, was there anti-Semitism in Ukraine? Yes, and the post-revolutionary period did see an increase in vandalism and other attacks on Jewish infrastructure, but actual attacks on Jews remained rare. While in Western, you go to Paris, you go to Berlin, you go to London, you might have to be a little bit nervous walking the streets because there's violence against Jews. I've always been nervous visiting my wife's family in France. But when you're in the former Soviet Union, there's much more tolerance for anti-Semitic rhetoric in the media. There's, things that people can say things that would get you, would bring down social opprobrium in the West, but actual physical violence is much rarer. And the Russians were making it out as if the Ukrainians were, participating in pogrom after pogrom against the Jewish communities. And as the war continued, we saw two things that happened, two parallel trends. One was a battle over Ukrainian history and how Ukrainians treated the Jews in the past. And the second was the disintegration of Jewish communities in the face of the Russian onslaught. I'll start with the second. And what happened was you had these Jewish communities in Donetsk and Lugansk, in Mariupol, and when the Russians started the war in the East, many of these Jewish communities found themselves stuck between two sides, were fighting it out, and one side ostensibly fighting on their behalf, but nobody was really, caring so much what happened to the Jews as such. The Russians used the issue of anti-Semitism, not because anybody cared about anti-Semitism, but if you want to tar the other side as fascists and sort of tap in to the legacy of the Second World War, the fight against fascism, it's very useful to tar your opponents as anti-Semites. But regardless of the fact that they said they're fighting for the Jews, the Jewish communities in these areas started to rapidly disintegrate. The separatists were brutal against the local populations, Jewish or not Jewish. Jewish people, there was one incident I remember of a Jewish man being shot to death by separatists because he refused to give up property that they wanted to confiscate. There were incidents of separatists following up on rumors of weapons in the synagogue, busting into the synagogue in Lugansk and scaring the people inside. And what ended up happening is you have this massive exodus from eastern Ukraine going to the west of Ukraine, central Ukraine, and leaving to Israel. And these communities essentially disintegrated. So the Donetsk Jewish community, they fled down to Mariupol, which itself in this war has been basically totally destroyed. And from there made their way onto Kiev. And in Kiev, they established a new synagogue called Kedem, the Kedem community. And this was a community for people who had been displaced from the Donbass and from Crimea. And when the Russians came in this time around and attacked, this community that had rebuilt itself from the ashes was forced to flee again and ended up in Romania. The rabbi of that community, displaced for the second time in 8 years, led a convoy of dozens of cars and buses across Ukraine and over the border. And during this period of 2014 to 2018, the first few years of the first phase of the war, about 30,000 Ukrainians ended up fleeing to Israel. And I interviewed dozens of these people over the course of researching my book. And I would always ask, were you fleeing anti-Semitism in Ukraine? And the answer always came back, I can't remember one exception to this. No, we're fleeing the war. We're fleeing the violence. We're fleeing the economic collapse. The fight to liberate, to save the Jews ended up destroying Jewish communities. And this is something I'll get to in a minute, but we're seeing the same thing happening now. The second thing we saw during the first phase of the war, which I mentioned, was the fight over history, which was that the Russians kept tarring the Ukrainians as Banderites. In response, the Ukrainians wanted to de-Russify their culture, their history, their national narratives. And they started looking for national heroes who could be held up as examples of Ukrainian heroism. And they naturally looked to people who fought against the Russians. The problem is many of the people who fought against the Russians were followers of Bandera, were people like the UPA commander Roman Shukhevich, Bandera himself, Andrei Melnik, the leader of the Melnikite faction. And without getting into all of the granular detail, the Ukrainians passed a series of laws essentially cementing the status of these groups as cementing the status of these groups as national heroes. And what we saw was streets across Ukraine being named after these groups, all sorts of media promoting, whitewashing these groups. And they weren't promoting the fascism or the anti-Semitism. They did something very interesting, which was to try to rehabilitate these groups by painting them as liberal Democrats, saying they were for a multi-ethnic Ukraine, they were for democracy. There were actually Jews in the UN and the UPA, things which patently ridiculous on the face of it. But it wasn't so much anti-Semitic in intent as anti-Semitic in impact. Meaning, I don't believe they were motivated by anti-Semitism as much as they were willing to do something which was fundamentally anti-Semitic for other reasons. And the Russians obviously made good use of this. This was a real problem. This is something I was reporting on a lot, because let's not ourselves engage in whitewashing. The Ukrainians aren't fascists. They're not Nazis, but they were doing something which is a major problem across Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans in the post-Cold War period, which is that attempt to heroize, to whitewash figures who were intensely problematic in the pursuit of a new national narrative. We see this in Lithuania, we see this in Poland, we see this in Hungary. We've seen this a lot in Russia with the revival of the cult of Stalin. So this is what the Ukrainians were doing was egregious, absolutely egregious, but it wasn't unique. And what the Russians tried to do is take something which is a very big problem, but not a unique problem, but a regional problem, and turn it into something uniquely Ukrainian and say, the Ukrainians are bad because of this. Nobody else is doing this. This is just, they're worse than everybody. It was really, I feel, something that was deeply dishonest, but it worked because there's a core of truth, and good propaganda is based on the core of truth. Now, this is the same thing we're seeing this time around. The Russians came and said, we have to denazify. And what do they mean by denazify? There was a really revealing article in the Russian press that got a lot of coverage in English language media. This was an article in an official government newspaper in which the author essentially said, any manifestation of Ukrainian independence, of Ukrainian identity that's in opposition to Russia is fundamentally Nazi. Nazi doesn't have to mean National Socialist. It doesn't have to mean anti-Semitic. It doesn't have to mean fascist. It just has to mean anti-Russian and pro-Ukrainian. And they essentially said that they want to, destroy the very idea of Ukrainian identity, which is, obviously deeply problematic on multiple levels. They want to destroy Ukraine as an independent nation. And when the Russians first started making these claims, I remember calling up people I knew in Ukraine, community leaders, and the basic response was disbelief, meaning, okay, they're bombing us to save us. They're suddenly philo-Semites. They want to save us from the Nazis. What Nazis? And over the course of the last 3 months, we've seen Russians repeatedly attack Jewish sites in Kharkiv, Ukraine's second city. Russians have bombed the Drobitsky Yar Holocaust site and memorial, destroying a memorial menorah on the site. They've bombed the building containing the city's Hillel. They have shattered the windows of the synagogue. The dormitory of the local yeshiva had part of its roof torn open from shrapnel of some sort. And in Mariupol, well, it's hard to know what's left of the Jewish community. The local rabbi, who's an Israeli, left for Israel several days for a medical procedure several days before the invasion. And he decided to take his family with him in case something happened. He didn't want to be separated. And he was stuck here when this happened. And he spent the last 3 months getting call after call from congregants saying, you know, this relative died, or we're stuck, or we can't reach grandma. And there was one case of one member of the community who was killed by a rocket walking to the synagogue to try to find someone to help him evacuate his family. The synagogue was obviously bombed out of existence, as was the rest of the city. So, you know, the whole thing has been very strange because there's two groups. The Russians say they want to help. Ethnic Russians and Jews. Now, the ethnic Russians, the cities that they have pounded into the ground are the most ethnically Russian cities in the country. You know, if they want to stop Ukrainian Nazis, well, it's a very strange approach to bomb the ethnic Russians back to the Stone Age. And if they want to help the Jews, well, I would say stop bombing the synagogues. But this type of rhetoric, you know, the Russians are not people to let reality get in the way of good rhetoric, and they've painted themselves into a rhetorical corner. But we saw this when their foreign minister came out and essentially accused Zelensky of being an anti-Semite and a Nazi, said that Hitler had Jewish blood, and then accused the Israelis of supporting Nazism. Now, when they started to get pushback on this, it was funny in a deeply dark and depressing way, but a little funny nonetheless, because Russian Foreign Ministry put out an extended letter that they published on the social media app Telegram, trying to justify their rhetoric. And I remember reading this and laughing because there were three sources that the Russians quoted to prove their allegations. One was Edward Dolinsky. He's a Ukrainian Jewish activist, the director of a group called the Ukrainian Jewish Committee. You think like the Ukrainian version of ADL, but much smaller. They try to do the same type of things that ADL would do. And he's, you know, an anti-Semitism watchdog, and he's very much sort of the bête noire of Ukrainian ultranationalists because he's always on TV and in the papers criticizing. But he's a patriotic Ukrainian. The man is not a Russian stooge. But the Russians said, look what Dolinsky is saying. Well, I called up Edward and I go, are you aware of this? He goes, no, they didn't ask me. Everything they're quoting from me is taken out of context. And some of what he said, it was kharif enough, sharp enough that I would rather not mention it in polite company. The same happened when I called up Kavi Dreyfus. She was also one of the sources the Russians quoted. She's a Holocaust historian at Tel Aviv University. They were citing work that she had, statements that she had previously made about the Judenrat, about the Jewish committees that had been forced to work with the Nazis. And same thing. No, the Russians never consulted me. What I said actually proves the opposite of what they're saying. No, the Russians are terrible. And the third group that they quoted was the Israeli Diaspora Ministry. And the spokesman for the ministry is an old friend of mine. We used to work together at the Post. I call him up. Same response. They are quoting, they were so desperate that they were quoting public statements by their biggest critics, trying to prove that that they were right. Now, the darkly humorous part about this, if you want to be generous in terms of using the word humor, was that the they sort of had a point in that they didn't have to prove things, persuasively. They didn't have to say things that made sense. They could say things that were easily debunked, because the majority of the people reading their propaganda are not reading my debunking in Haaretz. They're not going to be looking to English or Hebrew language media and going, "Oh, well, I was wrong to believe this." They know they have a captive audience among many people, and that's the worry, because we can debunk these things in the West. The rest of the world knows that this is crap, and many Russians know that this is crap. But there's still a large audience of people who are going to believe this. Who are going to believe that they're fighting fascists and that they're rescuing Jews and that they're really fighting against a modern day Banderites. And that's the scariest thing of all, that they are just going to keep doing this. And we've seen a large outpouring of help for the Ukrainians from the rest of the world. And the Ukrainians look like they're starting to make serious progress in the war. But as long as this continues, unfortunately, I feel like the Jews are going to be dragged into the middle of a conflict that has very little to do with them. And as Natan said, this is having, horrific implications for Jewish communities in both countries. The number of Jews moving from Russia, I don't have the absolute latest figures in front of me, but last time I checked, were equal to or greater than those coming from Ukraine, because of just how bad this has been on the effects of this on the Russian Jewish communities have been horrific. There's the economic impact. There's the fact that this has led to, to the state taking action against members of liberal movements and against the intelligentsia, and because there have been actual threats by the Russians against Jewish communities. One source of mine in a community over there told me that he was threatened 3 times by representatives of the Kremlin, telling him to get behind the war publicly or they would shut down his synagogue. And I have had other sources, which I can't cite by name, but which confirmed that, communities were being threatened by the Kremlin. So, it's a very worrying situation. Hopefully, the more the Ukrainians are able to push back against the Russians, the less damage it will be both to Ukrainian and Jewish civilians, to everybody living there. And hopefully we'll see an end to the conflict. But in the meantime, I don't think we're going to see an end to the weaponization of anti-Semitism, racism, and xenophobia. I think if it's okay with everyone, I'd like to open it up to questions. Anyone have a question?
Yes, so questions are submitted in the chat. I can read them off to you first if you like.
Here we go. Okay, so there was someone asked if the current Russian army has any Russian Jews fighting Ukrainian Jewish soldiers. So I am not aware of specific Russian Jews fighting in Ukraine. It's quite possible, but it's hard to know at the moment. What we do know for sure is that there are definitely Jews fighting on the Ukrainian side. There are Israelis who are volunteering to train Ukrainian forces. You have Jews who have been joining up across the country to fight for their country. There was one case in Kharkiv of a Jewish member of the Territorial Defense Forces who was blown up in a Russian airstrike. That we knew about because Hillel International and the local Hillel in Kharkiv put out statements and videos of the man from immediately prior to his death. What we also know, and this is what's very interesting about the issue of Jewish fighters, is that the issue of Jewish fighters has become part of the propaganda conflict. As the world was riveted by the last stand of the Ukrainian soldiers in the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol. They were the last soldiers hanging on. And part of this group were soldiers belonging to the Azov regiment, which had started as a far-right neo-Nazi volunteer unit that was eventually incorporated into the National Guard and still maintained ties with far-right movements. And the Ukrainians, senior aide to Zelensky told the Times of Israel several days before the end of the fighting in Mariupol that up to 40 Jewish heroes were fighting in Azovstal. Meanwhile, a couple of days before that, a newspaper owned by the Russian military ran an article claiming that hundreds of Jewish mercenaries were fighting on, Israeli mercenaries were fighting on the Ukrainian side, including in Azovstal. And there was sort of like a propaganda battle here over, are there Jews and are there Israelis there? And there was really no way to know, but each side sort of likes to claim that there's a Jewish role, but they color that Jewish role slightly differently to push their own propaganda, their own propaganda line. Looking at the questions here, someone asked to what extent the Russian propaganda is trusted by urban and rural Russians. That's really the million-dollar question, because obviously you have significant numbers of younger people who are using VPNs, trying to get around Russian censorship and get actual news about what's happening. I think that the people who are poorer or less informed or less educated are more likely to believe Russian propaganda. People of an older generation who rely more on television than the internet are much more likely to respond, positively to Russian propaganda. And polling in Russia has also shown significant support for the operation, though this is one of those issues where I think many people would be scared to say what they really believe, because it's a criminal offense now to even call it a war, let alone to condemn it. So it's very hard to really know here.
We also encourage participants to raise their electronic hand. If you have a question, you may also be able to ask.
Someone here, I'm looking through this as well. Someone asked about reconciling the virulent brutality of Ukrainians against Jews during the Holocaust and the support expected to be given them by Israel today. I think that's actually a really good question, because I think many of us in the Jewish community tend to look at what's happening in Ukraine and look at Ukrainians through a historical lens without being aware of everything that's happened in the decades since. There's still obviously anti-Semitism in Eastern and Central Europe, but the last few decades have seen major changes in society. We've seen processes of democratization, of increasing tolerance. And one thing that we've seen in Ukraine is the creation of a civil patriotism that's not necessarily ethnic in nature. I think that whether or not one wants to support Ukraine or not, I think that's a decision that has to be made based on everything that's happened since the 40s and everything that's happened since the 90s. History didn't stop at the Holocaust. History didn't stop at the end of the Cold War. I think it's something that we can agree on now, that the Ukrainians are definitely fighting for their own democracy and fighting for their independence, and that we're not seeing, 100 years ago, when Russians and Ukrainians were fighting against the Tsar during the Russian Civil War, we saw massive pogroms. Ukrainian leader Simon Petlura's forces massacred Jews. The Russian whites massacred Jews, and we don't see this now. We see a very interesting change, which is the Jews are still used, but instead of attacking the Jews and saying the Jews are, undermining us, the Jews are our enemy, it's the other guys hate the Jews. We're the friends of the Jews. It's still a problem, but I think it's a problem we'd much prefer to have. Okay, I see a question from Avital Mills. Here, you can,
Avital, it's spelled correctly with an H or hey in Hebrew. So I have been living in the United States for quite some time. I'm originally born in Israel and raised in Israel. And, when I moved to Connecticut, which I no longer live in because I've had many incidents of anti-Semitism in that state, the Anti-Defamation League, I thought that they were great. They have completely moved away from their support of Jews. So when you bring them as an example, and actually a few years ago, they had the National ADL said that Trevor Noah, when he was selected to be the new host of the Comedy Central show, the ADL had a big uproar about his anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, and misogynistic comments.
I'm not really sure that do you have a question specifically about Russia and Ukraine? Because I'm not sure that the ADL itself is a topic that we're discussing right now.
I understand that, but you did mention them, so please bear with me for a moment. The Connecticut ADL decided to invite Trevor Noah as their keynote speaker.
I'm sorry, I would prefer not to discuss this. Is totally off of the topic. Do you have something specifically about Ukraine?
I'm giving the background here, so please bear with me. Usually Israelis are impatient, so when you say that people in Ukraine are acting like the ADL, I'm a little perplexed with that because the ADL, as I tried to explain, is no longer working to do anything that has to do to combat anti-Semitism. So I just don't understand what is this entire world being so pro-Ukraine when there's clearly anti-Semitism there and always has been, and saying that somebody. Please explain that. That's where my connection to the ADL comes from, because I don't understand why are they being given an example of Ukraine has something similar.
Okay, so I think you're asking why are people supporting Ukraine if Ukraine has anti-Semitism? I think that Ukraine has anti-Semitism the same way that Russia has anti-Semitism, that you have anti-Semitism in Finland or in England. The entire point of what we're saying is that the issue of anti-Semitism or lack of it is extraneous to the conflict, that the use of the Jews in the conflict is one of propaganda. The level of anti-Semitism in Ukraine is not particularly special. There have been times when it's been higher than elsewhere in the former Soviet Union, but that's not particularly high overall. I think that that's a very important issue to keep in mind.
Okay.
Next question.
We have Pierre, if you want to unmute.
Pierre, there we go.
Thank you for
Pierre,
the presentation. I just wanted to ask you a question regarding Putin's supposed philo-Semitism, which has been evoked by Natan Sharansky at the beginning, and whether that's the case, and how is it going to play in this war, or is it going to play in any way? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. The truth of the matter.
Unmute.
The truth of the matter is that Putin's philo-Semitism, as many people like to describe it, I don't think it's particularly relevant per se. Meaning, obviously, he's not, for the most part, overall, weaponizing anti-Semitism in a fashion in which he's blaming Jews or attacking Jews. We saw that more traditional type of anti-Semitism in Foreign Minister Lavrov's recent comments. But overall, we haven't seen attacks on the Jews per se. But what we have seen, which is bad enough, is this willingness to weaponize the Jewish issue for propaganda purposes. And that's a significant problem. So while he might not be anti-Semitic inherently, and while he may have fond feelings for the Jewish community, everything that he does is calculated to preserve his own power, his own rule, his own influence. And if he has to use, and instrumentalize the Jews to those ends, he will do so. And we've seen that repeatedly. Maybe it would be worse if he wasn't to a certain degree philo-Semitic, but what he's done has been bad enough. And we've seen, very anti-Jewish rhetoric as well. What we've seen, at one point, there was a critic of the Kremlin, a liberal journalist in Moscow, who had a pig's head placed outside his door and the word Judensau written across the entrance to his home. We had one Jewish Russian propagandist on state television listing Jewish critics of the Kremlin and saying these people aren't real Jews. So, he's perfectly willing to use the Jewish issue, no matter how damaging that is to the Jewish community, and threaten Jewish communities to back him up if necessary. So it's not that he's necessarily acting out of anti-Semitism, but what he's doing seems functionally anti-Semitic, regardless of the reasons for it. So that's been something important to keep in mind.
Excuse me, just there have been pictures in the press about Putin together with the Rabbi Lazar, like me, who's the Rabbi of the Lubavitcher in Moscow. Do you have any information on how this group and other groups in Russia relate to what's happening?
So it's hard to really get anyone from organized Jewish communities in Russia to speak on the record. What we did see, which was something very interesting, was about a month ago, one of the two competing Ukrainian chief rabbis filmed a video in Kiev where he called down the wrath of God on the Ukrainian leaders of Russian Jewry if they didn't stand up and say something. And the next day, Beryl Lazar, the chief rabbi of Russia, who's very close to the Kremlin, put out a public statement on a community website saying that war is divinely forbidden and that he offers himself as a mediator to end the bloodshed, which wasn't a full-throated condemnation of the war by any means whatsoever, but was about as strong as you could expect given the circumstances. I think that, I fail to see how many Russian Jewish leaders can be in favor of what's happening. But you have to keep in mind that they have to be very, very careful in what they're saying. And I don't think we can realistically expect more from them than we've seen. Trust me, I have tried to get comments, but it's difficult.
Could I comment here?
Yes.
I have been studying anti-Semitism since I sold my business 20 years ago, and I have found that when it comes to Jews, lying is the modus operandi. It doesn't matter even if it's Jews that are lying or anti-Semites that are lying. It's time for Israel to do what the Jews of the world did to make Israel, and that's to save the Jews all over Europe and even in North America. What they should do is have a survey of Palestinians. If you are for Israel, say so and stay. And if you're not, send them to the West Bank.
I think this is a little beyond the scope of our current discussion.
No, it isn't. The point is, I'm sorry. The point is, Israel has to take the Jews that can't live anymore in Europe to their country and pay back what the Jews of the world did for Israel. They had a survey, and 75–80% of the Palestinians didn't want a Jewish state. Who needs them? They're not our friends.
I think you raise an interesting issue regarding Jews coming to Israel, and that's something I'd like to touch on again, which is that we've seen in a period of months more aliyah from Ukraine than we've seen in a period of years after the first phase of this war. But what's interesting about that is that many more are either staying in Ukraine or staying near Ukraine. And because this is something that's a very interesting dynamic now, is that men of military age are not being allowed out of Ukraine right now. So when people are leaving, their families are getting split up, Jews and non-Jews. And so we're seeing a lot of people waiting in Germany, in Romania, in Poland, hoping to get back or to have their families join them. I think we are definitely going to see a surge in Aliyah, but at the moment, you know, it's not as much as I would have thought, even though it's you know, it's very high. Now, speaking about Israel, and this is something I think is important and that people have asked about in the comments, Israel has had a very interesting position regarding this conflict. I know that Natan, I interviewed Natan for Haaretz about this, and I know it's, you know, he has very strong views on the issue, that Israel has been very careful in how it's approached the conflict. On the one hand, there are security concerns regarding Russia's presence in Syria, because there's been security coordination between the Russians and the Israelis in terms of Israeli strikes that the Russians have allowed to go ahead unmolested against Iranian and Syrian targets. And at the same time, there's been, you know, a very big concern about getting involved and endangering that cooperation. So the Ukrainians have really been unhappy with the extent of Israeli support. The rhetoric that the Ukrainians have been employing has created some, you know, some tension between Kiev and Jerusalem when the Ukrainians say, you know, we saved you during the Holocaust, and they make ahistorical, you know, assertions, and therefore you need to help us. That creates a certain amount of bitterness on the Israeli side, and the truth is, many, I think, Israelis are upset that Israel isn't doing more for the Ukrainians. But Israel has really been trying to carry out this balancing act, and Israel had for a long time refused to even condemn anything coming out of Russia. Now, this obviously was changed by the massacres in Bucha and the use of anti-Semitic rhetoric by the Russian Foreign Ministry. But Israel has still been really walking a tightrope. It sent a field hospital, it sent, you know, tons of aid, of civilian aid, and it sent body armor for civilian responders. But it's much less than the Ukrainians want. Before the Israelis sent the helmets and the body armor, for instance, I was at a briefing with Yevgen Kornichuk, the Ukrainian ambassador, and he pulled out a helmet and he put it on his head and he banged on it. He went, who am I going to kill with this? Just send us helmets. This isn't lethal aid. Who am I going to kill? And I think that there's a certain amount of tension even now between Kiev and Jerusalem over the war. And there's been sort of an interesting, subplot, so to speak, of this conflict, of the way Israel's sort of been dragged in. It's, the same way that the Jewish issue is, a leitmotif of this conflict. The Israeli issue has been as well, though that is more for legitimate reasons of statecraft than for, wanting to weaponize Jews in this case.
Okay, so
yes,
we're a bit over time, so that's, if you want to do one last question, you're welcome to do so. But then we're gonna have to wrap up.
Yeah, I see someone asked about the role of Chabad in the conflict, and I think that's worth a note, and it's probably a good note to end on. Is that the role of Chabad has been very interesting, because after the fall of the Soviet Union, there were really two main outside groups that came in to Ukraine and Russia to try to rebuild communities. Obviously, you have the Reform movement and the conservative movement. You have local cultural and religious organizations that sprang up. But as mass movements, you had two groups that came in. One was the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the Joint, which set up a network of social service centers called Cheseds across Russia and Ukraine. And you had Chabad, which helped to restart communities across the former Soviet bloc. And what's interesting about that is, while these are communities that are largely secular, the leadership tends to be Chabad Hasidim. So, for instance, when I was writing my book, a large chunk of what I was writing about was of necessity about the Hasidic community in Ukraine, because they've disproportionately taken over leadership positions. So there's a lot to be said about what Chabad is doing, but from what I've seen overall, I've been very, very impressed by what they've been doing to safeguard communities and to provide help to Jews, observant, non-observant, non-Jews, even, that they're just there and they're helping. One thing that we don't have time to get into, but I mentioned in the book, and I think is interesting, and I'll briefly mention, is that we did see actually something of a rabbinic conflict paralleling the military conflict, in which the Russian and Ukrainian rabbis, since the beginning, have been lobbing shots at each other, rhetorical shots, attacking each other. But at the same time as that they're attacking each other, on a rhetorical level, the Russian Jews have put in a lot of money over the years to help dispossessed and displaced Ukrainian Jews. So the Russians come in and destroy communities. The Russian Jews come in and try to help rebuild these communities, even as both Jewish communities are lobbing potshots at each other. So, as was just mentioned, we are running long, so I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to attend. I will shamelessly self-promote and recommend you all buy my book. And thank you all for coming. And I hope this did something to help raise awareness of what's happening right now, because really we need to at least be aware of what's happening. We can't turn a blind eye to what's happening to, our people.
Thank you very much, Sam. And thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.